Okay, Bergson and the Holographic Theory of Mind. Continuing, part 35. We'll be talking on the Integrated Information Theory of Consciousness, Giulio Tononi's IITC. And of course, we'll be asking, well, what is information in actuality? And what are the axioms of experience, as IITC likes to identify them? But what should they be? And we'll be hitting then the failure to grasp, as usual, the hard problem, dynamics. And the question starts to arise, does Gibson even exist? What we'll be seeing is a perception theory, a weak perception theory, but typed as a theory of consciousness. IITC, Integrated Information Theory of Consciousness. It is a child of Giulio Tononi. Tononi is a neuroscientist and psychiatrist who holds the David P. White Chair in Sleep Medicine, as well as a distinguished chair in consciousness science at the University of Wisconsin, not far from me. In fact, if we take that little red schoolhouse there, church, and replace it with the imposing University of Wisconsin, well, there we've got it. And then we'd have me at the near the hard hat there, just above the city by Milwaukee, where the ship is coming in. So he holds an MD in psychiatry and a PhD in neurobiology. And though I've not paid a lot of attention to it, I have seen it referred to as, to quote, an increasingly popular neuroscientific account of phenomenal experience. And therefore, that makes me pay attention. It is time for, shall we say, a bit of reconnaissance. Launched from a humble farm in Jackson, Wisconsin, above Milwaukee there, upon that intellectual fortress, the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I warn people that have been following this, we're going to see some familiar themes. In fact, one will probably be able to critique this theory themselves without my help. Starting point. At the start, I find the very start of Tononi's argument curious. Tononi acknowledges the explanatory gap, or the hard problem, as per Chalmers. If, as he says, one tries to explain, quote, even in principle, why a particular set of neural elements in a state, say some nervous or neurons within my brain firing and some not firing, should give rise to experience, that is, feel like something. So he says, IITC acknowledges that one cannot infer the existence of consciousness starting from physical systems. That is, to quote from matter, never mind. That is, one will never get mind out of matter. But note the subtle change of the problem already. It is not about inferring consciousness. It is explaining how you get consciousness out of neurons. And then feel like. You're trying to explain what it is to feel like something. This is a pernicious misdirection that obscures the problem again, the origin of the image of the external world. This is conscious experience. This is the giving rise to experience, the coffee cup and stirring spoon. This is what you're trying to explain, not so much to feel like something. The priority is this, the image of the external world. So we start with a And, he goes on, instead, IITC takes the opposite approach. It starts from experience itself by identifying its essential properties, which you'll call axioms, and then infers what kind of properties physical systems must have to account for experiences' essential properties. That is, the postulates, the physical postulates, sort of phenomenological axioms and physical postulates, which instantiate them, as we'll see. So this is his attempt to do a 180 on this problem and start supposedly from the phenomenology, the experience. So he goes on. Then IITC employs the physical postulates to derive for any particular system of elements in a state whether it has consciousness, how much, and of which kind. So somehow, this more physics, this better arranged physics or information within the physics is going to solve this, the gap, while simultaneously voiding, mysteriously, this very problem from matter, never mind. That is, as he started, you cannot derive consciousness from pure physics. This is Chalmers' stricture, as I'll call it later. So a very subtle sleight of hand has already taken place. We're going right back to what he said couldn't be done. So again, we're wondering about the very validity of the origin of this theory. So the claim is that IITC proposes that consciousness is integrated information in a system. So consciousness is integrated information in a system, the degree of which is signified by the Greek letter phi. Quote, integrated information is indicated by the symbol phi. The vertical I stands for information, the circle O for integration. So the quantity of integrated information, or consciousness, present in a system is quantified by phi, which is the amount of information generated by a complex of elements, above and beyond the information generated by its parts. So he's promising a numerical index of consciousness by phi. So the claim is the substantial difference between IITC and other philosophical or neuroscientific theories of consciousness is that it recognizes the significant amount of data given to us in our everyday experience. Again, this is the supposed 180-degree difference. And we're going to get a So IITC is claiming that consciousness can be captured in terms of varying quantities of integrated information. And phi is the measure of this. Hang on. The derivation of phi is not going to be one of our worries, or the mathematical description thereof. But how is IITC driven by our everyday experience? Tononi employs 5 undeniable attributes of conscious experience, which he calls phenomenological axioms. They are intrinsic existence, composition, information, integration, and exclusion. Now, these are obviously questionable. Tononi admits that they are not exhaustive, but exhaustiveness is hardly the point. In this case, we're going to be looking at the core adequacy of this characterization in another way along the way. And a warning, these are not even close to the attributes, these axioms, that Bergson and Gibson would describe for consciousness. So according to IITC, these axioms are evident to us through our experience, and so the theory takes them as axiomatic in constructing a theory of consciousness. For Tononi, these phenomenological axioms are evidence enough to then derive a set of physical postulates. These postulates will explain how these aspects of our phenomenology can be realized through a physical system, for example, the brain. Now note here then, the axioms then end up being the same as the postulates. The postulates are the physical system's instantiation of the experiential axioms. So you have the same 5 physical postulates implementing the same 5 experiential axioms. So how is this done? Well, this how question is answered by the constraints detailed in the physical system's postulates. To give an example of how the axioms relate to the postulates, let's take a look at the second axiom and postulate of IITC, composition. Consciousness is structured, he says. Each experience is composed of phenomenological distinctions, elementary or higher order, which exist within it. Example, sitting at your favorite local coffee shop, a white coffee cup in front of you. If you're SpongeBob, a latte steaming inside. Within that experience, there are the phenomenal distinctions. There's a white cup, then there's the whiteness itself, there's the cup, there's the relation in front of SpongeBob. It's on the table. That would be another relation. There is the table, there's the on the table, there's the steam rising. I mean, one could go on forever, as we'll soon see. All create a composition of phenomenal distinctions. For physical systems to be able to instantiate this composition, to quote, the system must be structured. Subsets of system elements composed in various combinations must have cause-effect power upon the system. So cause-effect power, a key point. The composition, composing all of these attributes, which is given to us in our everyday experience, is the result of cause-effect powers of elements in a system. In other words, they're interacting with one another causally. These are able to bring about change to one another into the system as a whole, thereby revealing phenomenal distinctions. Another one of these axioms then is intrinsic existence. For an element to intrinsically exist, an element must have cause-effect power upon itself. It must make a difference to the overall character of the state of the system as its states evolve and change over time. So we have elements, the composition of elements, the cause-effect power of elements, and the distinctions among the elements. So in the brain, we get a picture of something like this. Elements, table in front of brown, white, steam, cup, all interacting causally with each other. So again, these are all the elements of the scene. The white of the cup, the brown of the table cup, and of course we could continue to split this scene up in many of these bubbles. So for this, we'd have a phi value indicating the degree of consciousness. And since we have so few bubbles, well, we're not going to get a whole lot of phi value out of this. More maybe the phi value of a sponge, which might be appropriate for who's looking at the coffee cup there. So these separate elements of a scene, the distinctions, they're intrinsically existing, interacting causally, and from this then we're deriving the image of the scene, the experience, which is the image of the external world. So we have causally, for example, looking at our bubbles, white interacting with cup causally to produce the white cup. And brown would be interacting with the table, my little double arrows there, to produce brown table. We'd have steam, don't have the bubble there for the surface, but steam would be interacting with the surface, presumably for steam rising. In front of, so the cup is in front of me, the table is in front of me, I have to get cup plus table in front of me. Likewise, the steam is in front of me, I have to get cup plus table plus steam in front of me. And so all these interactions go on and on. Now, all this is supposed to be explaining the binding of these elements into one scene. The this being this myriad of causal interactions between these static bubbles, allowing us to produce, or allowing the brain to produce, allowing this physical system to produce the one unified scene, cup on table with steam rising. So in other words, these causal interactions are the glue that holds all these disparate elements, concepts, distinctions together. A quick initial pass on the problems. one wonders, well, is the elementizing not infinite? If you simply look there, even at that simple scene, where there's the cup, there's the relation of the handle to the cup, there's the relation of the white stripe to the cup, there's the saucer, there's the relation of the saucer to the cup, to the handle, to the white stripe, to the surface of the liquid, to the steam. There's each steam wisp, the relation of each steam wisp to each other, to the table, to the coffee, to the SpongeBob, if he was still there. There's each pixel of the scene. Does each pixel relate to the other one? Each grain and line in the wood, all interacting with each other, with the cup, with the legs. In other words, there's a giant matrix of spatial relations of each of these to every other. Where does this end? And by what principle is this elementizing done again? By what principled method would we ever delineate and describe as a principle for the brain how these elements are derived, created, used? I mean, in the first place, as you've seen me say before, this is standard. This simple presumption that there's some principle by which this could happen is always the unspoken assumption. It can be done somehow. And the real problem, this is all static. That basically static scene of the cup on the table. But make the scene dynamic. Make it a coffee stirring event. Yes, now you're into the invariance laws, the invariant structure of an ever-changing event, as we've seen multiple times: velocity flow fields, adiabatic ratios, inertial tensors of the spoon, acoustical invariance, texture gradients, ratios, flows. What is this structure, this information, this dynamic information with invariance defined over these physical forces over time? What is that? Where is that in these static bubbles? Take the adiabatic ratio, which the energy of oscillation over the frequency of oscillation. This can't exist in a static bubble to be causally related to yet another static bubble. It exists only over extended time. Further, this ratio is coordinate with the inertial tensor, with the radial flow in the surface of the coffee, with the acoustical inflammation, the clinking. So it's all dynamically related over dynamically changing time. So these bubbles would be changing unbelievably instantaneously, all to be coordinated with one another over time. Remember, these invariants are amodal. They cut across modalities, across the acoustic, the optic, the haptic. Other examples, if you remember, the acoustical frequency. When I pour water into the glass there, the sound pitch rises proportionally with the optical rise in the liquid's height. In other words, you have an invariant that is defined amodally across both aspects of the event, the acoustics and the optics. Or the train approaching, looming. The looming of the train engine has an expanding radial flow field across its front. And this is coordinated with a wide range of frequency values expressed by the Doppler effect as that sound rises and falls as it goes by you. Again, optical with acoustic. Therefore, the brain is resonating over time to this amodal information, which is coordinate across all the modalities of the event. This is binding. That is, this amodal or cross-modal information defined globally across the brain makes binding unnecessary. That the brain needs multiple elements, bubbles, trying to causally affect one another to hold or stitch the event together. It needs it like a hole in the head. If you look at the actual aspects of events and their invariance laws. Nor does this information exist in a static bubble, again, to interact with other static bubbles. Take this further. Make the cup a cubical cup. The eyes are saccading over it in constant motion, so there is flow over the sides. But remember, the form of the cup is specified over the flow fields. Remember, the velocity vector flow field, or flow field consisting of velocity vectors as we move toward the mountains in the sun there, or defined across the rotating cube. And the edges, therefore, in that cube are nothing but sharp discontinuities at the junctures of these flows. The edges do not exist in a static instant. Again, remember, the eyes are always constantly saccading over this, creating the flows, even though it appears static. So these edges only exist over these flows. They cannot exist in a static instant. Again, remember, if the ellipse there is rotating too fast, the velocity vectors are changing too rapidly, and the very rigidity of the ellipse is lost. If we strobe that rotating cube out of phase with the symmetry period, the rigidity is lost. That is, those rigid edges and vertices are simply gone. They're a function of flow over time and periodic invariance. Just to make it worse, let's make our coffee cup, let's make it 3 cubes rotating. Now imagine all the causal relations that have to be dynamically changing continuously and instantaneously over time if we start to break that event right there down into the relation of each edge to every other edge and every other cube with respect to all the squares on the gradient there. Well, let's add in a couple more cubes that we can easily see. Do you understand the actual significance then of this dynamic change? How do you possibly represent this in static bubbles? Or let's just make the cup look like this. And now imagine what's happening in that matrix of so-called bubbles of aspects of the event. There is no static bubble in which an edge exists, which can be causally related to yet another edge-holding static bubble. But just looking at this instantaneous causal affecting elements aspect of IITC again, there's a problem with standard physics, with relativity. Hagan and Hirafuji looked at emergence theories of consciousness in the context of special relativity. And IITC is an emergence theory. The coffee cup experience emerges globally from all those causal interactions and the elements interacting. There are myriads of these causal links for IITC that must be occurring in the brain at some velocity, one to the other. Suffice it to say that Hagan and Hirafuji show that no globally emergent state could be maintained without the breakup of simultaneity within and across the elements of the perceived event. For example, in coffee stirring, you have a simultaneity with the clinking as the spoon nears the cup edges, with the swirling surface, with the motion of the spoon, with the adiabatic invariance, the periodicity felt by the arm, etc. All that would break up by the theory of special relativity. And Hagan and Hirafuji show other SDR-related problems as well I won't go into. Now we have seen my stance on special relativity in 8A, 8B. Yet, if you are priding yourself, like Tononi, on being a physical theory of consciousness, that is, you're working in the classic metaphysic of current physics, of which SDR is the epitome, well, sorry, but then you've subjected yourself to special relativity, and you have to deal with physical theory, that is, with special relativity and its current interpretation. Just saying. Now, whether this will be done is, I would suspect, doubtful. But let's hit the real problem. For IITC, we have all the elements of the scene in the brain. Now, they are not words, but they cannot look like this either. Coffee cups, brown, whites, steam, in front. I don't know how to represent it in front of. Nothing looks like this in the brain. There are no such images, coffee cup, table, steam wisp, browns, whites for that matter, in the brain. Yet somehow, by quote-unquote causal interaction, the image of the external world emerges. Yes, emerges from all this. So this is just wishful magic. There is no explanation of the origin of the image. We're just wishing that by my incredible set of bubbles and the interactions between them, and the constraints that Tononi describes, I'm not really going into, we somehow, with all this nice physics and arrangement of physics, produce an image. Of course, the talk is of experience, quote-unquote phenomenal abstracts, this abstraction, or feeling like something, as we saw. No, you have to explain the origin of the image of the external world. The table, the cup sitting on the table, this is the problem. How does that image actually arise? It can't be by magic. Again, what a theory of the origin of the image could look like. One that actually comes to grips with the image as an optical problem. So, with the indulgence of people who have watched this before, let me cast IITC in the light of what a theory could look like as Bergson gave one. As we know, in 1896 he argued that the universe is a holographic field. On the bottom right there, a field wherein at every point is the photograph of the whole, or the information for the whole. In his terms, the photograph already developed in the very heart of things, and at all points of space. And that, in essence, he saw the brain as forming a very concrete, dynamic, modulated, reconstructive wave passing through this field. So, the brain, reconstructive wave. Now, what's meant by a modulated reconstructive wave? Well, in the holographic framework, we're talking about the specification of an image. And in this case, we imagine that we recorded the object waves from 3 different objects, our cube, cup, and wine glass. And we've done that using a reference wave, each with a different frequency, just abstractly frequency 1, 2, and 3. And so we take the reference wave, beam it off the plate, but it's also reflecting off the object. The 2 waves meet, the reflected wave and the original reference wave, at the surface of the plate, forming an interference pattern. So we have an interference pattern from the cube with frequency 1, another interference pattern with the cup of frequency 2, and then an interference pattern formed by the reference wave of frequency 3 with the wine glass. Now, if we beam a reconstructive wave back through that holographic plate, then specified to the observer is the original source of that object wave. In this case, frequency 1, beaming that to the plate, the observer sees the cube. That is the source of the original object wavefront. If we modulate that reconstructive wave to frequency 2, then specified to the viewer is the original source from that object wave, the cup. And now we modulate that reconstructive wave set to frequency 3. And now specified to the observer is the wine glass. And we can modulate the wave back to frequency 2 as an example, and now the original source again is specified as the cup. So that's modulating reconstructive wave. So in the case of the brain, that is a modulated reconstructive wave specific to or specifying a source in the holographic field. In this case, coffee cup, spoon, stirring hand, etc. Now, the underlying dynamics of the brain, because it is a physical system, imposes a scale of time. That is, the image is specified at a particular time scale. In our normal scale, it's a fly that's buzzing by, but change the dynamics of the brain, alter that, and we could even have a heron-like fly, a different scale of time, slowly flapping his wings like a heron. Then the image, that coffee cup, is precisely where it says it is, in the field, external to the body. We're seeing the objects precisely where they say they are, in the external holographic field. This is termed direct perception in the Gibsonian framework. And finally, the modulation patterns of the brain are driven by the invariant structures of events within this holographic field, to bring back why these structures are so important. And to bring in time. The time transformation of the field is indivisible. There are no discrete instants, where each just previous instant falls into the non-existence of the past, thus having to be stored in the present brain. This is a complete repudiation of the instantaneous bubble model. And this is equal to a primary memory. This indivisible transformation of time provides a primary memory property of the field's transformation. Thus, the dynamically changing image is also simultaneously a specification of a past extent of the field's transformation. Things I'm leaving out here, the relation of subject and object, in terms of not of space, but of time. This is all involved in getting rid of that viewer up there, of the homunculus, viewing the object wave. Again, the holographic field is pure perception. It is, in this model, we're describing how perception is limited, not how it arises. But where in IITC is any worry about scales of time, the relation of subject and object, the time-extended continuity of events, invariance laws, structure thereof, or how the events are perceived externally, external to us, external to the body. But we move on for just a little more. For IITC, the billions of neurons equal elements. The elements equal information states as they fire, activating various regions of the brain. They form integrated complexes. Again, we see where the whole is always greater than the sum of the parts. This is actually part of the magic. These express information greater than the information generated by those elements independently of each other. So everything, in order to get the coffee cup steaming on the table, each of these bubbles is ultimately giving rise to something greater than the sum of the parts. And again, as we saw, there's cause and effect. If the elements have a cause and effect that is different from other elements, cause and effect on the system, then it can be said that they have a cause-effect repertoire, which is to say that in the repertoire, we're looking at all possible causes and effects that an element or a given set of elements can have. So to quote, information refers to how a system of mechanisms in a state, through its cause-effect power, specifies a form, or, quote, informs a conceptual structure because of all the concepts, distinctions, elements in the bubbles, in the space of possibilities. Again, the repertoire of causal effects, that is, possible possibilities. Again, to quote, consciousness is specific. Each experience is the particular way it is. It is composed of a specific set of specific phenomenal distinctions, thereby differing from other possible experiences. For instance, differentiation. So in other words, just because I have different information leading to a cup in one case versus a hippo in another case, I have explained the image of each. Right. Difference of image 1 versus image 2 is not the theory of the origin of any image. It's not a theory of the origin of the image of the cup or of the hippo. But the above is what it all boils down to. It's all that Tononi's, quote, new view of information is. Meanwhile, any consideration of the invariance laws defining time-extended events is simply gone to the trash bin. But for Gibson, this is the information that defines events in the ecological world. The very information ignored in this IITC. One other quick comment. The differentiation notion invoked here, that is the innumerable discriminations or elements. This is all backwards. These elements are concepts, these conceptual structures, what have you, are differentiated post-perception. They are conceptual. They're creatures of a metaphysic. The brain does not dwell in the already differentiated world of the classic metaphysic. That is in the piles of analytical sand that we discussed in Zen and the Art discussion. This is elementary Gibson and Bergson. A critic of IITC, Garrett Mindt, recalls Chalmers. To quote Chalmers, "The structure and dynamic of physical processes yield only more structure and dynamics. So structures and functions are all we can expect these processes to explain. The facts about experience cannot be an automatic consequence of any physical accounts." That is, this is Mindt discussing Chalmers' definition of the hard problem. How do we get the image of the external world out of physical processes? For Mindt, IITC seems to make the argument that if experience arises from the structure and dynamics of integrated information states, fancy arrangement, shall we say, of this physical system, then it is entailed by these integrated information states and so posits an identity to explain that entailment. The identity he's referring to is this: information states equal neural elements, as the picture shows, equal the image of the external world. We've simply made a physical identity. That is, physical information states equal the image of the external world, which is a pretty baldly exposed problem. You still have magic. It's still the hard problem. And zero theory of the image of the external world. Now, Mindt was deeply disturbed by this simplistic identity at the heart of IITC, which is to say that raw physicalism, that is, physical states equal experience. That is our image of the external world, same as experience. Given this, he says IITC must come up with a new definition or concept of information. But IITC has thrown Gibson's definition of information, that is, invariance, into the trash. If it did use Gibson, it would and could no longer be IITC, not even close. Let's look at this quote we just saw. The structure and dynamics of physical processes yield only more structure and dynamics. Everything here depends on what you think dynamics is, and two, your metaphysic, within which dynamics is embedded, necessarily embedded in the metaphysics. Their concept of dynamics, along with the classic metaphysic in which it happens to be embedded, is crippling these theorists. Remember Chalmers' own crippled notion, the demon in a neural net, running around noting inputs and outputs of neurons in a network, thereby, to quote Chalmers, preserving the dynamics, which is to say, in reality, simply preserving the pure abstract computation, which, under other devices, could equally be computed. That is, abacus, beans, and shoeboxes, register machines, etc. That is, concrete physical dynamics is not important in this case simply the computations being carried out. At least, he kind of understood that you can't get an image of the world from this form of dynamics. Bergsons' model of the brain, however, is a very concrete dynamical device, as concrete as an AC motor generating a field of force. That is, we have very real structure and dynamics, very concrete. But it must be embedded within his temporal metaphysic, his model of indivisibly flowing time, or the indivisibly transforming holographic field. So this embedding in the metaphysic, just as the temporal metaphysic, just as, in my opinion, physics will eventually have to be. This framework breaks Chalmers' stricture. No consciousness from structure or dynamics. That is, no consciousness from pure physics. The very stricture that Tononi tried to defeat with his 180-degree, let's start from experience, move. Stay with this stricture, and therefore its surrounding classic metaphysic. To explain experience, you are forced into some other realm. The mental, the angelic, the emergent, anywhere but in the physical realm. You have no place else to go. You can't stay within the physical, by definition. But will Bergsons' framework ever be considered? The fact is, IITC, supposedly a theory of consciousness, is in reality a theory of perception, and a very poor one. A theory that does not truly consider what it must explain, the dynamic nature of events, the form of information, the true form of information defining them, what information actually is. This is endemic in consciousness research and consciousness theory. The inverse of this, where you have a theory of perception that is in actuality a theory of consciousness, I once described in the history of my 2000 JCS article, Bergson Perception and Gibson. For it was nearly rejected, considered not appropriate for a journal of consciousness studies because it was about perception. It's interesting, but it dawns on me that by this criteria, had Bergson been attempting to publish his matter and memory nowadays in a series of books that was sponsored by a Journal of Consciousness Studies, well, by that criterion, it goes into the trash bin. Not about consciousness, about perception, about memory. So this is not understood. A true theory of perception that explains the image of the external world is a theory of consciousness. A theory of consciousness must be a theory of perception. So hence, the genesis of IITC and so many others like it, in this fundamental misperception, non-comprehension of the fact that you must have a theory that explains the origin of the image of the external world, which is equivalently experience, which is a theory of perception. So next time, we'll return to the question, is experience stored in the brain? Be my third installment on this subject. So, till then, signing off.